Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Forward into the Past. I'm J.C. Reday, your host and narrator, and today we're picking up where we left off in the mysterious Nick Carter's ghost story, exactly as it appeared in the weekly story paper, the New York Weekly, way back in 1894. Story papers have a long and varied history. The weekly story papers were sold in major cities around the U.S. and the U.K. as well. Across the pond, they were known as penny dreadfuls and other such quirky names, as befitting our neighbors across the sea. The stories that appeared in story papers were almost always reused in what were known as dime novels, which, like story papers, began to appear in the mid-1800s. During the Civil War, it was not uncommon to send a soldier fighting in a skirmish in a completely different state a dime novel so that he could read it during downtimes and in between battles. It is said that even President Abraham Lincoln carried a dime novel in his inside coat pocket to distract himself from the horrors that surrounded him, and indeed, the entire country. Dime novels generally ranged in size from paperback book size to magazine size. Now, to make matters worse, dime novels ranged in price as well, anywhere from 5 cents up to 15 cents. Competition was fierce in the 1890s. Nick Carter's New York Weekly stories were reprinted in his own weekly dime novel series, The Nick Carter Library. Thanks to the publishing competition between the publishing houses of Street and Smith, Frank Tousey, and others, many weekly stories were used again and again to add luster to new formats tried out by all the houses. Street and Smith, the publishers of the Nick Carter stories, excelled at it. Nick's stories were at various times part of the New York Weekly story paper, the Nick Carter Library, and the New Nick Carter Weekly. The main difference, in the library version being 32 pages long and costing 10 cents, making it a true dime novel, and the weekly version being slightly smaller, but about the same number of pages and costing only a nickel. The library stories were usually printed with black and white illustrations on the cover, but the nickel weeklies were using a vibrant color cover printed on better quality paper. To make matters even worse were the thick books, which were also printed by various print houses, but especially Street and Smith. But I will leave the discussion of those for a later podcast, because I would really like to get back to Nick Carter's ghost story, if you will indulge me. In our last episode, our master detective, Nick Carter, was told the story of the vanishing jewelry pieces from one of the grandest mansions in the U.S. at the time, the Plummer House in Long Island. Assuming the theft was due to the fact that most mansions had secret passages and entryways for servants, Nick nonetheless took the case, mainly for the curious insistence that the current owner of the Plummer property, Colonel Richmond, was making, that the jewels were being stolen by a ghost. Is it really a ghost? Or is someone really behind the thievery? And should the jewels stay with Colonel Richmond's daughter, Mrs. Pond? Or should they go to the poor Miss Millie Stevens instead? Well, let's find out as we go forward into the past once again and crack open the case file of Nick Carter's ghost story. Chapter 3. How Nick Found the Jewels. It certainly looked like sheer recklessness for this thief, whoever he might be, to play his game on Nick almost at the very moment when the great detective appeared upon the scene. Shrewd as Nick was, he had not expected this. His first thought, as the reader knows, was that it was a bold challenge, the defiance of a nervy criminal who thought himself absolutely safe from detection. But a moment's reflection made this seem less probable. Was it not more natural to suppose that this event proved that the detective was unknown to the thief? Such being the case, Colonel Richmond, his nephew, and Mrs. Pond were acquitted at the start. It may seem ridiculous to suspect them in any case, but so strange was the nature of this affair that Nick gave nobody the credit of certain innocence. Colonel Richmond was certainly very nearly crazy on one point. He might be so much of a lunatic as to commit these robberies from simple delusion. Or he might wish to prove his daughter that the diamonds were not rightfully hers. Mrs. Pond might be pawning them for small extravagances, which she was afraid to have known. As to Horace Richmond, there was no motive which seemed plausible. The value of the articles taken was so small as to make the game not worthwhile for a man in his position, and it was perfectly certain that no professional thief or dishonest servant was doing the work. If such a person had been in the game, he would not have taken one of those diamond pins. He would have taken all three. It was impossible to lose sight of the fact that the Stevenses would be the real gainers if this ghost business led Colonel Richmond to insist that his daughter should give up the jewels. Mrs. Stevens and her daughter could not be doing the job personally, but they might have a secret agent among the servants, or more probably concealed in some secret recess of the strange old house. Nick resolved to go see Mrs. and Miss Stevens without delay. He hoped to judge by their conduct whether they knew anything about the robberies. These thoughts passed through his mind in a flash. He quickly searched the room to be sure that the thief was not concealed in it, and then descended to the main hall. The outer door was open, and Colonel Richmond and his daughter were standing on the steps. Just as Nick joined them, Horace Richmond strolled up. They all stood looking at a carriage which was coming up the driveway. "Why, it's Mrs. Stevens!" exclaimed Mrs. Pond. "I thought you said she did not come here any more." "Well, she hasn't been here in some time," responded the colonel. "I've thought that she avoided us because of the matter of the jewels." Nothing more could be said on the subject, for at that moment the carriage drew up before the door. Colonel Richmond advanced courteously and assisted Mrs. Stevens to alight. Nick noticed at once that she was much agitated. Colonel Richmond asked her into the house, but she said that she preferred to sit on the veranda. She had come on business and would stay but a moment. She evidently wished to speak to the colonel privately, and so the others stepped aside, but Nick's eye was upon the woman every moment. Very few words had passed between them when the colonel uttered a cry and called to Nick. The detective instantly advanced. He made a sign to Richmond, but it was not understood, and the colonel introduced Nick by his right name. "Here is an extraordinary thing, Mr. Carter," he said. "We now have proof positive that this affair is not the work of mortal hands." "What is that?" asked Nick. "The jewels have appeared." "Where?" "In Mrs. Stevens' house. They have been mysteriously transported there without human aid." "I should be glad to have that proven," said Nick. "It shall be," said the colonel. "Tell your story, Mrs. Stevens, if you please." It is very simple," she said. "This noon, when I returned to my room after lunch, I found upon my dressing table certain pieces of jewelry which I recognized as having belonged to the late Miss Lavina Richmond. I knew them well. Nothing that I can imagine could have surprised me more than to find them there. I have no explanation to offer. I can't explain how it happened." Nick could explain it very easily, at least so far as the appearance of the jewels in that particular place was concerned. It looked like a natural development of the plot. But his face expressed no emotion as he asked, "Who had access to that room?" "Nobody," replied Mrs. Stevens. "It was locked." "Is it customary for you to lock your bedroom door when you go to lunch?" "No, it is quite unusual. But we have a new servant in the house, and as I had considerable money in the room, I took that precaution. All the doors were locked. I had the key to one of them. The others were on the inside of the locks. When I went to lunch, the jewels were not there. When I returned, there they were. That is all that I know about it. Here they are." She drew from her pocket as she spoke a small cardboard box. The woman was making heroic efforts to be calm, but it seemed as if she might either faint or go into hysterics at any moment. Was she playing a game that was too hard for her? That was the question for Nick to answer, and yet, when he looked at this gentle, refined woman, he hardly had the heart to suspect her of any dishonesty. "I will show you the jewels," she said, struggling to command her voice. "You can then see whether they are all here." Her trembling hands could hardly find the string which was tied about the box. While she pulled at it, she kept talking as if she must do it to relieve her overburdened mind. She described the articles of jewelry which were in the box. "They are the very ones," said the colonel. As he uttered the words, the string was loosened, and the cover fell off the box. There was a sharp cry. It came from Mrs. Pond, who, with Horace, had approached during this scene. "Why, there's one of my diamond pins!" she exclaimed. "How on earth did it come to be there?" Well, if Mrs. Pond was surprised, she wasn't a bit more so than Nick Carter. The pin referred to was the one which had been stolen from the cushion in Mrs. Pond's dressing room not 10 minutes before. "Why, this is impossible!" cried Mrs. Pond. "I left that pin with 2 others like it in my room." Without saying another word, she turned and ran into the house. Almost immediately, her voice was heard in the hall. "It's gone!" she cried. "It's been taken out of my bedroom." She appeared at the door with a very white face, but her excitement was nothing to that of Mrs. Stevens. Nick dropped the role of detective and assumed that of doctor in less than a second. When he had saved Mrs. Stevens from an attack of hysterics, he said, "I was aware that that pin had been taken. It was done while I was in your room, Mrs. Pond. The circumstances were exactly the same as those attending the other robberies." "But I did not put it in the box," exclaimed Mrs. Stevens. "It was not among the jewels which I found." She turned to Colonel Richmond. Her face was ghastly pale. "I have scorned your belief," she said, "but now I am convinced. No mortal being could have done this thing." "What do you say to that, Mr. Carter?" cried the colonel with flashing eyes. "I would like to ask a few questions," rejoined Nick. "Were you alone when you put those jewels in the box?" "I was." "Has it been in your possession ever since?" "It has not been out of my care." "Did you tell anybody about the finding of the jewels?" "Nobody." "Please describe everything that happened after you found them." "I was, of course, greatly agitated. I did not know what to do. For some time I sat staring at the jewels and trying to think what was my proper course. At last I took this box from a drawer of my dressing table and put the jewels in it. Then I called to the servant, who was in the dining room, and asked her to see that the carriage was got ready. For though it is a long drive, I had resolved to make it, because I felt safer in that way." "Did you go out of your room to call the girl?" "Only into the hall." "Who could have got into your room while you were out?" "Nobody." "Where was your daughter?" "In her own room." "How do you know?" "I called to her after I had dressed, and she answered me. I told her that I was going to drive over here, and she was very much surprised. I did not tell her why." "Did you meet anybody on the way over who spoke to you or came to the side of your carriage?" "Nobody." "That is all I wish to ask." In fact, Nick had no more questions. He was really at a loss for an explanation of this strange occurrence. If the pin had been taken from the room by a person concealed in the house, it might have been possible that the person had escaped from the grounds unseen and had given it to Mrs. Stevens. There was hardly time for such a trick to have been done, but in so strange a case every possibility was to be considered. If such a thing had been done, it must have been very near to the house. The thief must have known when Mrs. Stevens was coming, or she must have waited for him just outside the colonel's grounds. There was a place where the road was heavily fringed with trees, not more than 100 yards from the colonel's gate. The trick must have been done there, if at all. Nick resolved to settle this small point, if possible, immediately. It was of no use to ask the man who had driven Mrs. Stevens' horse. Of course, he would lie, if there was any need of it. So, Nick excused himself from the group on the pretext that he was going to search Mrs. Pond's rooms again. He remembered that just after Mrs. Stevens had arrived, a wagon belonging to the colonel had driven into the grounds. He quietly looked up the 2 servants who had been in this wagon. They told him that they remembered seeing Mrs. Stevens drive up. She had passed them on the road. They had had her carriage in sight for a mile before it turned into Colonel Richmond's grounds. Her horse had been driven at a good pace. It had not stopped. Nobody had approached the carriage. Nick was convinced that the men were telling the truth. Then how had Mrs. Stevens obtained that pin? Her possession of the other articles might have explained, but the pin was a stickler. Chapter 4. Millie Stevens. After questioning the two men whom he had found in the stable, Nick walked toward the house. On the way, he met Horace Richmond. "Mrs. Stevens has gone home," said Horace. "She would not remain for dinner, although she has such a long ride before her. She seems terribly distressed by this strange affair." "What did your uncle say to her?" "Not much," was the reply, "and I was a good deal surprised. He begged her not to be nervous about it, and talked very pleasantly to her, but he steered clear of the matter of the jewels. I don't understand it. I thought he would insist upon what he calls a restitution of the property." "Perhaps, after all," said Nick, "he isn't so far off his base on the ghost question as you think he is. Don't you deceive yourself about that. He is just as sure that his aunt's spirits removed those jewels as you are that that house is resting on its foundations. And I wouldn't try to shake his belief just now," continued Horace seriously. "Simply say nothing about the affair this evening. Talk about something else to it. Stay with us as long as you can, and quietly look the ground over. Then tell me privately what you think." This advice seemed good to Nick. He passed a quiet evening in the house, and nobody but Mrs. Pond referred to the robberies. Horace managed to quiet her quickly, but the next morning after breakfast, she came to Nick with a very long face. "My father has been talking to me," she said, "and I'm going to lose those jewels surely, unless you do something and do it very quickly. I don't care for their value, but they're mine by right, and I mean to keep them if I can. But, of course, I can't bear to make my father's life miserable. It will probably end by my compelling my husband to let me give them up." Nick had his doubts about the possibility of such a thing, and they were made certainties very soon afterward. Mr. Pond arrived unexpectedly. When the story was told him, he danced the war dance, as our young friend Patsy might have expressed it. "You don't seem to realize the importance of this matter," he exclaimed. "Why, it's $1 million robbery, that's what it is. If we give up the jewels, the colonel will give us their value. By jingo, he'll have to. Well, what's that but the theft of $1 million from him?" Nick was compelled to confess that it was just that, and nothing else. "And who'll reap the proceeds?" continued Pond. "Why, the Stevenses, of course. Nobody else gets anything out of it. They're playing on the colonel's superstitions for $1 million stake. Now, Mr. Carter, you go ahead and work this thing out. Catch the thief. Don't let the colonel get you out of the way. If there's a question of money, I'm good for the best fee you can name." Nick's first move that day was to go to Mrs. Stevens' house. She lived well on her small income. It was a nice old country house, with grounds of considerable extent, and a stable in which 2 good horses were kept. Nick rode over there on one of Colonel Richmond's fine saddle horses. As the detective rode up the winding shaded walk toward the house, he noticed a manservant just ahead of him. This servant had a newspaper and some letters in his hand. He seemed to have come from the village post office. Leaning over the railing of the veranda, as if waiting for this servant, was one of the handsomest girls Nick had ever seen. She was a beauty of the dashing, dark-eyed type, a girl of courage and strong will. The servant gave her the letters just as Nick had come into sight. He not only gave her those he had been carrying in his hand, but he drew one from his pocket with a motion that suggested secrecy. Nick rode up to the veranda, introduced himself, and asked to see Mrs. Stevens. "Let James take your horse," said the girl. "Come into the house, if you please. I will speak to my mother." Nick went into the cool and pretty parlor. Miss Stevens left the room for a moment, and then returned with her mother. The detective spoke of the occurrences of the day before, and requested permission to see the room in which the jewelry had so mysteriously appeared. While they were talking thus, it happened that Miss Stevens drew her handkerchief from her pocket, and as she did so, 2 little pieces of paper fell to the floor. "So she's read that letter and torn it up so soon," was Nick's silent comment. Almost immediately Mrs. Stevens said, "There's mail on the table, Mother. I forgot to give it to you. There are several letters." Mrs. Stevens glanced at the addresses. "They are all for me," she said. "Was there nothing for you?" "No, indeed," cried the girl. "There's nobody who writes letters to me." "Lies to her mother, does she?" said Nick to himself. "Well, it begins to look bad for her." Miss Stevens did not notice the bits of paper on the floor, and Nick, by clever work, succeeded in getting possession of them. Then, by Mrs. Stevens' permission, he went to look at the room already referred to. No sooner was he there than he got rid of the lady upon some plausible excuse, and so had an opportunity of examining the bits of paper. They were ordinary letter paper, impossible to trace. One bit was blank on both sides. The other bore some queer little marks, but no writing. To Nick, the marks were quite clear. They were the dots and dashes of the Morse telegraphic alphabet. They represented the letters N, T, B, E, T, R, A, written very small on a narrow scrap, not more than an inch long. "Don't betray," muttered Nick. "Worse and worse. Miss Stevens will evidently bear watching." As to the room, his inspection of it was of little use. He had not expected much. He had come to see Miss Stevens principally, and in her case the investigation had certainly begun better than he could have reasonably expected. She was engaged in some secret affair. She concealed letters from her mother. She had bribed one of the servants. This last fact was proven by the manner in which the letter had been delivered to her. As he was turning these matters over in his mind, Mrs. Stevens and her daughter entered the room. "What have you discovered, Mr. Carter?" asked the girl. "You must know that my mother has told me all about this strange affair, and I am deeply interested." "I have learned nothing," said Nick, "except that this room can be easily entered, even when the doors are locked. Take this door, leading to the rear room, for instance. The key was on this side, it is true, but it turns very easily. A person with a pair of nippers could get in without trouble and lock the door afterward. I can't tell from the appearance of the key whether or not this was done, but I think it probable." "You mean that somebody came in here while Mother was at lunch and put the jewels where they were found?" "Exactly." "But who could it have been?" "I don't know," answered Nick frankly. "And how do you explain the presence of that other pin in the box?" asked Mrs. Stevens. "There is an explanation," said Nick, "but I prefer not to give it now." "As you please," responded the lady haughtily. "I can only say that I trust you will find this thief speedily and end this annoyance to which we are being subjected." "I don't think it ought to be hard for a person of your abilities," said Miss Stevens. "I have already solved the puzzle." "And who is the guilty person?" asked Nick with a smile. "Oh, Colonel Richmond, of course." "Why should he do this?" "Because he is crazy. That's reason enough." "I'd like to hear you explain your theory a little further." "Why, Mr. Carter, I'm surprised at you. Is there any motive for this so-called crime?" "No." "Then it must be a crazy person's work." "Is there more than one lunatic among us?" "Certainly not. So, as 2 and 2 make 4, and the sun does not rise in the west, Colonel Richmond is the man. What kind of a detective do you think I'd make?" "There isn't one alive who could compare with you," said Nick. "You're joking." "No, I'm serious. There are plenty of detectives who can reason up to the wrong man, but none, I'm sure, who can do it so quickly as you can." Mrs. Stevens laughed at her daughter's discomfiture, and the girl joined heartily. "Now, supposing for a moment that your theory is true," continued Nick, "how do you suppose that Colonel Richmond managed to get the jewels over here?" The girl became serious in a moment. "This is a very delicate subject," she said. "I hate to cast suspicion upon anyone." "Oh, you refer to the new servant, of course." "Well, we know nothing of the girl," said Mrs. Stevens, "and, of course, when anything so strange happens in the house, we naturally think of her. She brought good references, and she certainly looks honest." "Did she have an opportunity to put the jewels into this room?" "As to that, I have talked it over with my daughter, and it seems just possible that the girl could have done it. I thought at first that it was not." "Of course it was possible," exclaimed Miss Stevens. "She could have run up the back stairs at any time." She proceeded to explain this theory until it seemed quite plausible. And yet, all the time she was filling the detective's mind with the blackest suspicions against herself. Here was the case. The plotters were trying to work on Colonel Richmond's superstitions. A celebrated detective had been called in. If he succeeded, The plotters failed, and the Stevensons lost their jewels. What more natural than that the criminal should wish to throw the detective on a wrong scent? Was it not to be expected that they should pitch upon this new servant as the best person with whom to deceive Nick? Altogether, Miss Stevens was making out a very strong case against herself. Okay, what is going on here? Is our master detective actually stumped? How are all these strange things happening? Is Millie Stevens really plotting this whole thing just to drive Colonel Richmond insane? Or who could be behind this ghostly encounter? Well, tune in next time for another thrilling episode of Nick Carter's Ghost Story. Once again, I want to give a huge shout out to the good folks at Project Gutenberg for providing this fine story for me to share with you. All their ebooks are available for you, or anyone, to download and enjoy completely free. Don't forget to support the show, gang. When you support the show through the Support the Show link or the Buy Me a Coffee link on our main webpage, you help support Project Gutenberg as well, as I will always donate a portion back to them for providing such wonderful stories to share. And there are thousands. Okay, until next time, guys, thanks for listening, keep sharing the stories, and be a good human. Bye for now.